Hello and thank you for tuning in to another installation of the Federalist Files. On today's show, we're going to be going over Federalist number 63. So this is going to be titled The Senate Continued. It's describing the very last paper. It goes on to answer some of those challenges from James Madison's dissenters. And it is written on March 1st, 1788. Topics include: the Senate affords a sense of national character and stability in times of crises, and the Senate is to protect the rights of the citizen even when they are willing to give up those rights, as in the citizen is willing to give up those rights. So this one's kind of, it's pretty long. There's a lot of important things to take from it in terms of certain elements that are really just grounded in our Constitution, and it's kind of some philosophy as well. So in this paper, Madison continues from the theme of his last paper, alluding to the fifth topic, illustrating the utility of the Senate. So that's going to be the role of this one, illustrating the utility of the Senate. A fifth, and he starts off, he states, and I quote, a fifth desideratum, illustrating the utility of a Senate, is the want of a due sense of national character. Without a select and stable member of the government, the esteem of foreign powers will not only be forfeited by an unenlightened and variable policy proceeding from the causes already mentioned, but the national councils will not possess the sensibility to the opinion of the world, which is perhaps not less necessary in order to merit than it is to obtain its respect and confidence. So what he's saying is you're going to have a specific national character that is to be derived, or it's rather to be homed much more or housed much more in the Senate than any other group, because they run these 6-year terms, unlike the House of Representatives that do a 2-year term. And the very important part of this quote specifically is where he talks about foreign powers, and we should not be forfeiting, the American national character to foreign governments or foreign powers, which we've seemed to do. We've lost track, we've lost our way in terms of what our national character is. Free markets, freedom, certain independence, liberty, sovereignty from government. We've gotten further and further away from those things, and that is what describes the national character. So next, just to sum that up, Madison claims this national character is essential for every government to recognize the individual merits of the particular plans of government and culture, and also to be used as a guide in tumultuous times, to be followed in order to revert back to that successful fundamental national character. So this is where I kind of get into that debate where I talk about multiculturalism. It doesn't specifically, it's not related to race or related to ethnicity. It's moreover related to a sense of national character, a certain culture within and we call it the American culture, and it's not derived from, ethnicity or race. So next he goes on, he states, and I quote, an attention to the judgment of other nations is important to every government for two reasons. The one is that independently of the merits of any particular plan or measure, it is desirable on various accounts that it should appear to other nations as the offspring of a wise and honorable policy. The second is that in doubtful cases, particularly where the national councils may be warped by some strong passion or momentary interest, the presumed or known opinion of the impartial world may be the best guide that can be followed, end quote. So he says this is important in terms of other nations because it's kind of wise, it's honorable, it's respectable to be consistent, to have this with other nations, have your own sense of culture. And then it's also important because it's a guide to be followed, is that sense of a constitution. When you go back to the drawing board and you're trying to figure out whether a law is just or not, you can go back and you can kind of look at that national character and you can figure out if we've lost our way or not, such as, the socialism, the welfare state that we've created and perpetuated in this country now for a good while. That is very far away from what our fundamental national character is. So Madison next he argues, he states, and I quote, yet however requisite a sense of national character may be, it is evident that it can never be sufficiently possessed by a numerous and changeable body. It can only be found in a number so small that a sensible degree of the praise and blame of public measures may be the portion of each individual, or in an assembly so durably invested with public trust that the pride and consequence of its members may be sensibly incorporated with the reputation and prosperity of the community. So he's saying this cannot be, this national character cannot be housed in a group of people that is very numerous as well as changeable, or malleable, where it's inconsistent, it's capricious, it's changing every single, let's say, 2 years or every single year. That's the reason for the longer terms in the Senate. And then he kind of mentions a little bit Rhode Island. He talks about how they have 6-month terms. This is actually a very long paper, so I'll talk very briefly. He notes multiple examples, but specifically he talks about Rhode Island and how they had 6-month long terms for the representatives, and how that was a complete failure because, once again, there was no character, there was no state character in that in the legislature in Rhode Island because of that. So in other words, the body of national character, the Senate, should not be a large, capricious body because the people need to associate decisions both poor and successful with a national face. Madison points out a defect of responsibility relating to the House of Representatives because the House of Representatives, particularly, they are so numerous and they are so changeable. It is difficult to assign any type of responsibility to them. And that's where he states this next. He states, and I quote, "Responsibility, in order to be reasonable, must be limited to objects within the power of the reasonable party, and in order to be effectual, must relate to the operations of that power." He continues, "The object of governments may be divided into 2 general classes, the one depending on measures which have singly an immediate and sensible operation, the other depending on a succession of well-chosen and well-connected measures." End quote. So this one's pretty significant here. He's saying the most important part, roles or objects of government, should be divided into 2 general classes, the one depending on the measures. So do you have the measures to do that job? Is that job of your discretion? Is it of your power to do? Is it your jurisdiction? And the second part is, do you have the measures in order to do that job? So the best way I could try to explain this is, you can't hold a branch responsible. Let's say you are holding, let me try to think of what the House of Representatives, specifically, let's say a state government goes forward with a tyrannical policy, or not even a tyrannical, just a policy that's not against the Constitution, but it has adverse effects. So, in result, you have people that live in the state of New Jersey will turn around and blame the President of the United States for the state governor's mishaps and failings. And that happens very often. Everyone usually just looks at the figurehead. That's the point of having the president. It's the guy to point at and blame, because the people that are in the Senate and the House of Representatives, they're really the ones to blame because they make most of the laws, all of the laws, really. The president just signs off on them. Then you have executive orders now through the president, and those are actual, I mean, in my consideration, they're not laws, but we treat them somehow as like laws / mandates. But the Senate and the House of Representatives are really the ones that are truly responsible for most of the laws that are enacted in this country. And they are the problem, but we all point at the big figurehead as the president, and that's the one that usually gets the blame a lot of the time. And then, every once in a while, they'll get the praise, depending on if they're a Republican or a Democrat. And he points that out in this one, and it's very weird because they were more afraid of the other branches being blamed for stuff that they were so worried. It's just so weird because the mindset was so different, where they were so afraid. They felt like the president needed certain powers to be able to defend himself against the legislative branch, but meanwhile now it's kind of just like the president goes in there and he just goes through with executive order after executive order, and then the legislative branch is almost happy that he's doing that job for them and making laws, because then they don't have to do their job and there's no responsibility. The government, the way that they're made is they hire bureaucrats purposely so they don't have to take any of the accountability when something goes wrong, or any of the responsibility. They're not held accountable, and they enjoy that. They propagate that. they exalt that type of lifestyle, and that's what they do consistently. They pretty much just point at the other side while all of them do nothing. They all do a pretty bad job overall. So we're better off just taking the power out of the government's hands so we don't have to worry about them screwing it up, because they screw everything up, it seems like, thus far. In other words, the people can only hold responsibility to government branches that control particular powers that directly correlates with the success of that specific topic. For example, the executive magistrate cannot be blamed for a state provision as long as it doesn't violate the Constitution that a state government enacts that somehow leads to a increased rate of unemployment in the state specifically. You can't blame that on the president. The president has really no jurisdiction. It's not the president's job to, make some sort of fiscal policy, or not even really. Fiscal policy actually kind of makes more sense. Well, yeah, it is not the president's job to make fiscal policy in your specific state. If that's the way that we're running this, we're no longer a republic. We might as well just be a pure democracy, or there's other forms of government that we would use where it's ran straight from the top down. So he goes on, he states next, and I quote, "An assembly elected for so short a time as to be unable to provide more than one or two links in a chain of measures on which the general welfare may essentially depend ought not to be answerable for the final result any more than a steward or tenant engaged for 1 year could be justly made to answer for places or improvements which could not be accomplished in less than half a dozen years. Nor is it possible for the people to estimate the share of influence which their annual assemblies may respectively have on events resulting from the mixed transactions of several years. It is sufficiently difficult to preserve a personal responsibility in the members of a numerous body for such acts of the body as have an immediate, detached, and palpable operation on its constituents." End quote. So that was a long one. Really what he's saying is, how are you going to hold someone accountable when they're only engaged in 1 or 2 years if they're in the House of Representatives? And then additionally, how are they going to have the share of influence? Because as a House Rep member, they have less political power than a Senate member, and they're not going to be able to remember as many things in these annual assemblies or these assemblies that they have, and because they have less experience under their belt. And then how are you going to hold people personally responsible when, for example, there's 435 House of Rep members? How are you going to blame 1 or 2 specifically for, these huge problems? Whereas with the Senate, you can kind of dumb it down a little because there's only 50 of them. So the remedy for this defect in the Senate, the remedy for this defect in the House of Representatives is having the Senate itself for that reason. Because it's a smaller amount of people, they have more political power, they have longer terms, they're also older, so they're going to be much more wise. They're going to know much more about the issues. So then he goes on, he states next, and I quote, "The proper remedy for this defect must be an additional body in the legislative department, which, having sufficient permanency to provide for such objects as require a continued attention and a train of measures, may be justly and effectually answerable for the attainment of those objects." He continues, "Such an institution may be sometimes necessary as a defense to the people against their own temporary errors and delusions." End quote. I think that one's very important because that lays out really what the difference between a democracy and a republic is. A democracy is, if you want to go for a full-on gun grab, all you need is the pure democratic vote. You need a majority, and that's it. There's nothing constituting any type of inalienable rights that the government cannot take away from the people. Because who is the giant group, even the majority in this country? Who's the majority to take away rights such as First Amendment or Second Amendment rights from the minority, essentially, even though they have a majority vote? Who are they to? Are they some sort of godlike figure that they have the right to confiscate the rights from somebody else? Really, that is the case. And in a pure democracy, that's a mob rule, and that's how it works. But in a republic, that's the difference, is that there's a constitution that lays out inalienable rights for the people, and it's for everybody. and they can't be taken away. And that's really the point. That's the difference between a republic and a democracy. And then, the representation's a little different as well, depending on if it's a compound republic or if it's federalism or what have you. But so Madison, he asserts that irregular passions and misrepresentations of interested men call for measures that need the remedy of a temperate and respectable body of citizens in order to check the misguided approach until they regain their reason. So that's if, like I said, after every single mass shooting, you see these numbers that come out. You have a bunch of people that want gun confiscation, they want gun control, they want this, that, the other thing. And that is the job of the... and everybody does take an oath on the Constitution when they're sworn in. That is the job of our political officials to protect the Constitution. And really, if they don't protect it, then we're going to have to protect it physically ourselves. So he goes on next, he states, and I quote, "As the cool and deliberate sense of the community ought in all governments, and actually will in all free governments, ultimately prevail over the views of its rulers, so there are particular moments in public affairs when the people, stimulated by some irregular passion or some illicit advantage, or misled by the artful misrepresentations of interested men, may call for measures which they themselves will afterwards be the most ready to lament and condemn. In these critical moments, how salutary will be the interference of some temperate and respectable body of citizens in order to check the misguided career and to suspend the blow mediated by the people against themselves until reason, justice, and truth can regain their authority over the public mind." End quote. So it's just exactly what I was saying before. That's the reason of some of these government officials that we vote in. They're supposed to represent us. They're supposed to protect the rights of the people, and that's obviously that's not the case. But that's the way it's supposed to work. So Madison, he recalls past republics and their lack of Senate. That is very similar. That is tantamount to that of the Constitution, wherein some they held life terms and filled vacancies themselves. Okay, so what I was trying to say here. Some that are kind of similar to the to our Constitution, the way they laid out the Senate, but the real problem is they had these life terms, and then they filled these vacancies themselves, which gave them a lot of extra power. It was really where the power was centralized in a lot of these republics in the past. The power was centralized in just one legislative body, but it wasn't a legislative body. It was just called the Congress, and they just ran everything. They were the executive. They were the judge, jury, and executioner. They did all the jobs. And so he compared them a little bit to that. And it was mostly Sparta. I think it was like ancient Greece. I think even Rome as well. He goes on to state them, but there's just so many of them. It's like I said, it's a very long paper. So he goes on to state, after comparing them, talking about them, then he goes to talk about America. He states, and I quote, "The genius of America are notwithstanding, when compared with the fugitive and turbulent existence of other ancient republics, very instructive proofs of the necessity of some institution that will blend stability with liberty." End quote. And this is very interesting when he goes on to kind of talk about liberty and stability, because in some of these republics there was a lot of liberty, but the liberty got to a point where it became factional, it became almost anarchy. So he remarks the difference between America and those other republics, and it's the principle of representation. So he states, and I quote, "Many of the defects, as we have seen, which can only be supplied by a senatorial institution, are common to a numerous assembly frequently elected by the people and to the people themselves. There are others peculiar to the former, which require the control of such an institution. The people can never willfully betray their own interests, but they may possibly be betrayed by the representatives of the people, and the danger will be evidently greater where the whole legislative trust is lodged in the hands of one body of men than where the concurrence of separate and dissimilar bodies is required in every public act." End quote. So this is really what he's talking about, the stability in this case is, and really I guess the liberty as well. If you lay all those legislative, and this is the reason that we have two chambers in the legislature, if you lay all that power in one legislative body, then that one legislative body can attempt to betray the people. So having two of them keeps the other one honest. It's an additional safeguard. So he goes on next, he states, and I quote, "The difference most relied on between the American and other republics consists in the principle of representation, which is the pivot on which the former move, and which is supposed to have been unknown to the latter, or at least to the ancient part of them. The use which has been made of that difference is reasonings contained in former papers will have shown that I am disposed neither to deny its existence nor to undervalue its importance." End quote. So he says really the difference is that we have a representation in this country. Who you vote for is who you get. Realistically, they're supposed to represent the people. They're supposed to be accountable to their constituency. Whereas with these other republics, you had the aristocracy. You had the rich dudes voting in their buddies, or they just took power and they didn't relinquish it, and they had these life terms. So he goes on to actually talk about specifically the democracies of Greece. He states, and I quote, "In the most pure democracies of Greece, many of the executive functions were performed not by the people themselves, but by officers elected by the people, and representing the people in their executive capacity. Prior to the reform of Solon, Athens was governed by 9 archons, annually elected by the people at large. The degree of power delegated to them seems to be left in great obscurity. Subsequent to that period, we find an assembly, first of 4 and afterwards of 600 members, annually elected by the people and partially representing them in their legislative capacity. Since they were not associated with the people in the function of making laws, but had the exclusive right of originating legislative propositions to the people, the Senate of Carthage, also whatever might be its power or the duration of its appointment, appears to have been elective by the suffrages of the people. Similar instances might be traced in most, if not all, the popular governments of antiquity, as in antiquated, old school governments that are obsolete." He's saying you have these bodies, these elected people. They were elected by the people at large. Great democracies, that's the pure democracy standard. Whereas with a Senate, you had the state legislative branch would be the ones that would elect the Senate members. So it gave the state itself, the state government, a power and a say in how the federal government is ran. In these pure democracies, that's not how it worked. And then he also said, you had a changing body because they were elected every single year, annually, every single year. And then there was a lot of power that was also held in their one of them, it said there was also an executive capacity along with a legislative capacity. So it was just kind of a mangle. It was a total mess. So he goes on, he states next, and I quote, "From these facts, to which many others might be added, it is clear that the principle of representation was neither unknown to the ancients nor wholly overlooked in their political constitutions. The true distinction between these and the American government lies in the total exclusion of the people in their collective capacity from any share in the latter, and not in the total exclusion of the representatives of the people from the administration of the former." So he does a little word soup here. It's kind of confusing, and then you got to read through it and kind of piece this out. So these Greek countries, they understood what representation meant. They had these annual elections. People were voted for, what have you. But the difference between what makes America's Constitution different and all these other republics, these former republics, is that in the American government, there is an exclusion in their collective capacity. So he means that there's actually going to be, the government's actually going to be listening to the people, and whatever laws the government makes are going to also apply to the government, to the people that work in the government. And that is going to be the true principle of representation. Really, it's that the people will hold the power, and the government's not going to hold some sort of extreme power itself. So when he says and from the share of the latter, he means in the collective capacity, and in the administration of the former, in the total exclusion of the people. So they were making it, he's pretty much making it like you have these representatives They're not going to have this total power over the exclusion of the people themselves. The people are kind of going to, rather the hands of the power are the people themselves are the ones electing the people in power, rather than some sort of aristocracy-like system. And it's also going to be, it's very spread out. There's that whole weights and balances to ensure safeguards on liberties. So Madison, he concludes this paper by answering the objection that the Senate, because of the longer term appointment by state legislatures, will transform into a tyrannical aristocracy. So he's going to go on. He's going to state next, and I quote, "In answer to all these arguments suggested by reason, illustrated by examples, and enforced by our own experience, the jealous adversary of the Constitution will probably content himself with repeating that a Senate appointed not immediately by the people and for the term of 6 years must gradually acquire a dangerous preeminence in the government and finally transform it into a tyrannical aristocracy." End quote. So that's just him characterizing what his dissenters would say about what the Senate's going to be, because technically they're not, in this case, they were not directly elected by the people. They were elected by the state legislative branch. So his argument back, he states, and I quote, "To this general answer, the general reply ought to be sufficient that liberty may be endangered by the abuses of liberty as well as by the abuses of power, that there are numerous instances of the former as well as the latter, and that the former rather than the latter are apparently most to be apprehended by the United States, but a more particular reply may be given." So just first, and this is before he goes on to talk about all of his other stuff, and this is a very interesting, and this, once again, the mindset at that time, it was actually more often than not that liberty actually endangered, or rather, having extreme, amounts of liberty caused anarchy, and that actually endangered other people's liberty. It was abuse of liberty on the other people. It abused other people's freedom. Or the abuse of power could also do the same thing. That's why there's the point of the balance of the system. If you have an abuse of power, tyrannical government, then they take away and they confiscate the rights of the people. But if you have liberty that's really just endless amounts of liberty, as in you could just steal someone's land, you can murder them, you can just do whatever you want, then it becomes anarchy. So there needs to be a balance to that system, is what he's saying. And actually, in the old age at this time, it was much more often that there was more liberty, and the liberty was the real endangerment to other people's liberty, other individuals' liberty. Which is actually funny, because now it's different. Now it's the government really is the one abusing their power. So he continues, he states, and I quote, "Before such a revolution can be effected, the Senate, it is to be observed, must in first place corrupt itself, must next corrupt the state legislatures, must then corrupt the House of Representatives, and must finally corrupt the people at large." End quote. So this is his answer to them, his dissenters stating that there's going to be a tyrannical aristocracy. He says, well, listen, they would have to corrupt the state legislature, they would also have to corrupt the House of Representatives, and then finally the people at large. If that's the case, if that's what they end up doing, then we're just not meant to have this government. We're not meant to have this country. Next he goes on, he states, and I quote, "It is evident that the Senate must be first corrupted before it can attempt an establishment of tyranny. Without corrupting the state legislatures, it cannot prosecute the attempt, because the periodical change of members would otherwise regenerate the whole body. Without exerting the means of corruption with equal success on the House of Representatives, the opposition of that co-equal branch of the government would inevitably defeat the attempt. And without corrupting the people themselves, the succession of new representatives would speedily restore all things to their pristine order." End quote. So he's saying if there is some sort of ill will, let's say in the House members, every single 2 years they're getting reelected, so there's just going to be a changing of seats. You're going to get those bad guys out of there. You're going to get the good ones back in there in the government, is really what he's saying. So to try to corrupt the House of Representatives, it just doesn't seem possible. It's impractical. And then the state legislative branch, the same thing, because those are the direct representatives of the people. So Madison, he notes that corrupting these state legislatures will require a mass overhaul of the system, furthermore regenerating the entire governing body of the country, which is highly unlikely. The House of Representatives alone would inevitably defeat the attempt, and the people at large would fuel the representatives to do so and restore the system, and lay waste to whatever new system they're attempting to create. So Maryland's state senate was actually selected the same way, indirectly by the people, which he kind of stated that one a little bit as well. And then he was talking about he was talking about all the Greek democracies. He was going over a lot of them in this paper. So next he states, and I quote, "But if anything could silence the jealousies on this subject, it ought to be the British example. The Senate there, instead of being elected for a term of 6 years and of being unconfined to particular families or fortunes, is a hereditary assembly of opulent nobles. The House of Representatives, instead of being elected for 2 years and by the whole body of the people, is elected for 7 years and is in very great proportion by a very small proportion of the people. Here unquestionably ought to be seen in full display the aristocratic usurpations and tyranny which are at some future period to be exemplified in the United States. Unfortunately, however, for the anti-federal argument, the British history informs us that this hereditary assembly has not been able to defend itself against the continual encroachments of the House of Representatives, and that it no sooner lost the support of the monarch than it was actually crushed by the weight of the popular branch." End quote. So I think there's the House of Commons and the House of Lords. I think that's what the Parliament is called in Great Britain. So what he's saying is you had the opulent nobles, these rich dudes, and they were the ones running their Senate. And it said that they were elected for a term of 6. They weren't elected for a term of 6 years. It was unconfined to these people that were rich and families and fortunes that were rich people, rich dudes pretty much. And their House of Representatives, instead, they didn't even have 2 years. They were running 7-year terms. And they still were able, their version of the House of Representatives, which I assume is, I think, the House of Lords. I'm not 100% sure. It was able to still stop the attempt to usurp their power in the Senate, even with a 7-year term, because that ill will was not able to penetrate the entire atmosphere of the House, their House of Lords, or what have you. So, and then that Senate also lost the support of the monarch. I'm trying to think, at that time they might not have had the House of Lords and the House of whatever the heck. I want to say House of Commons and the House of Lords. They might have not even had that system. It might have been totally two different names, but they did have the two branches within the legislative branch. So to end here, and this is the very last paragraph, he states, and I quote, "Besides the conclusive evidence resulting from the assemblage of facts that the federal Senate will never be able to transform itself by gradual usurpations into an independent and aristocratic body, we are warranted in believing that if such a revolution should ever happen from causes which the foresight of man cannot guard against, the House of Representatives, with the people on their side, will at all times be able to bring back the Constitution to its primitive form and principles against the force of the immediate representatives of the people. Nothing will be able to maintain even the constitutional authority of the Senate, but such a display of enlightened policy and attachment of the public good as will divide with that branch of the legislature the affections and support of the entire body of the people themselves." End quote. So he just makes that powerful statement saying how the House of Representatives will have the people on their side, and they'll fight against the Senate if they attempt to usurp their power, which just doesn't really seem like the case now. I just think the legislative branch doesn't really do much, and when they do, most policy that they make is just terrible, and mostly the president kind of does it through executive order nowadays, which is also terrible. So most law, from what I've seen, it seems like most law, most regulation turns out to be bad, especially at this point when we already have so many laws on the books. But That will be it for this one. I greatly appreciate everyone tuning in. Make sure you check out the current event podcast. I just had the weekend special. Make sure you check out the other one coming out. It's going to be coming out tomorrow night into Wednesday morning. I greatly appreciate everyone for tuning in, and I will see you next time. Thank you.